All right, and I'll go ahead and get us started. So first off, welcome. This is our third end of work cycle update for stakeholders. And the reason behind this event is that we decided to create it in response to some stakeholder feedback that it's really helpful for them to hold a regular update meeting at the end of each development work cycle to share what the Project Surfliner team has accomplished, as well as what work is planned to come next. So please let me or Jessica Hilt at UCSD know if there's information that you think would be useful for us to include. Sorry, I'm getting Microsoft updates as I talk. That would be useful for a future meeting, or it's not at Microsoft. Sorry, everyone. If you have an idea of another way to communicate this information, or you need different types of information in these updates. So thank you for coming today. We will try to keep this meeting both informative and concise. And whether you're joining us today or watching this recording, we do really appreciate your participation in the Surfliner project. Next slide, please. So this is today's agenda. We're just going to start with a brief recap, followed by updates for specific products. Today, it's just going to be focused on Comet, and then a brief overview of our next work cycle, and then lots of time for questions. Next slide, please. So today's a big day actually for Surfliner. It is our official 3-year anniversary of when we kicked off the collaboration on November 16th, 2018. And this slide just shows some of our accomplishments since then. So we've had 28 team members from 3 institutions, UCSD, UCSB, and recently UCLA, contributing on the geospatial product, working on 5 products, 2 of which are now in production. I think this number is slightly out of date. The team, I think, has now participated in 58 sprints, made more than 2,200 commits, and we've also sent probably at this point like 20,000 Slack messages, and received a Golden Setter Award, which is a UC Information Technology Award. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just a reminder that right now the team currently works in 56-day on-off cycles with a 2-week buffer on each end. That means we do 56 days on, 2 weeks buffer, 56 days off, another 2-week buffer. So our fall work cycle was held from September 1st through October 26th. And originally we had planned to run both Comet and possibly some Shoreline sprints during this time. But we ended up not including Shoreline in this sprint because our product owner ended up needing to be out of the office during that time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Gabriella to share the Comet update.
Hi, good morning. So I'll echo what Chrissy said. Thank you guys for taking the time to join us today. So slide, please, Tom. As a reminder, Comet is the staff-facing digital object management platform currently in development by UC Santa Barbara and UC San Diego. Next slide. For this fall development work cycle, we completed 4 sprints between September 1st and October the 26th. Some of those highlights include structural metadata based on the Portland Common Data Model, which is a model for structuring digital objects. That includes support for component objects as well as collections. We now also have file download, batch ingest, and batch workflow. But before I turn this over to Tom for the demo, I want to briefly mention that we also completed the Comet feature list document that captures Comet's aspirational, thank you, Tom, Comet's aspirational function, sorry, this cat is trying to jump on my laptop. Comet's aspirational functions extracted from our stakeholder user requirements. And here on this slide, we see that it includes an administrative dashboard and UI, content organization, file management, persistence and preservation support, metadata management, content lifecycle, bulk import-export, access controls, analytics, and reporting. Just know that the actual document has far more details in each section, and I look forward to sharing this out with you all very, very soon. So Tom, do you want to take it away to demo what was accomplished?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Okay. I'll probably jump a little bit between the slides and running system, but I do want to say that if you click through from the agenda to these slides, you will see like this is here less as a presentation and more as a reference for you all. So you're welcome to peruse it at your leisure. Yeah, so I'm gonna start just by showing a little bit of Comet's functionality. Some of this will overlap with things that folks may have already seen from the previous work cycle, but I'll try and highlight the things that are new. I think it's sort of helpful to just get a general sense for what Comet is actually doing. That's PCDM just for reference in case people are interested in that. I'd love to talk more structural data model for the subset of us that are interested in that. But I'm going to go ahead and demo object deposit, adding things to a collection as a starting place for this. Okay, so yeah. So here's a running Comet instance. I'm logged in as myself. I'm an administrative user. I'm going to browse us away from this workflow roles page. We'll get to that later. So if I want to deposit an object, I can do that. Let's make this demo object for, oh look, that's a test object for stakeholder demo. It's like I've been here before. And I'll go ahead and attach a file to that object. I can't actually attach multiple files, or in this sort of comical case, I'll do the same file over and over again. And if I save it, then I get an object that's deposited. That object now has these 3 files. We still don't have thumbnails, and I can talk a little bit about that if that's interesting to folks in another as we wrap up. But I do have the individual files, and if I would like to have a component object, I can do that. Component this can have its own files. We'll make it the same image again because I don't want to browse around looking for a different one. And hopefully that doesn't just hang there for too long. I'm just gonna peek and make sure that I haven't managed to crash this system somehow. No, it's okay. I might rush it. Did I actually get a component object, or am I hung up? Oh, we've got an error. That's fun. There always has to be something special and exciting in the demo. It looks like that didn't come through, and I wonder what's going on. I'm going to try it one more time just to make sure it's not a fluke. Component, try again. Oh, that one worked. maybe it was the file attachment that caused the problem. Anyway, we should be able to see from our original, oh, it didn't get attached as a component. That's interesting. Oh yeah, it sure did. Okay, it's just that this relations tab is sort of a confusing UI element, I think. Okay, so I can indeed see that this component object got added. It should be able to have files of its own, but I'm not going to dwell on it. If we want to talk about components and poke around at it in any question time, I'm happy to do that. But rest assured that this object can have files, it shouldn't error, and I have no idea what's going on. Okay. In the meanwhile, if I'd like to have a collection, then I can create a new collection. There's a concept of collection types. We can talk about that in another, in greater depth in another context as well. Collection or demo. I'll remind while I'm doing metadata entry that the metadata, as a result of some of our previous work in the last work cycle, the metadata for objects and collections is driven by configuration. So each campus will have its own metadata format or set of schemas that's available for objects deposited. And we're in the test app, it's just that we're only running like a really simple metadata format that has, well, I guess it has just a title. But anyhow, that's configuration driven, and it's sort of individual campus work to make sure that the metadata schema is as expected. Okay, so I added a collection, and if I would like to add my objects to a collection, I will go ahead and do that. Oh, very curious. I'm going to go ahead and try a different one. Did I make this? Yeah. Okay, so I can add an object to a collection. Oh. Love to do unhandled exceptions in the demo. Sorry about that. I think I can actually, though, see that this object is in the collection. This isn't the one I added. So I can see that it's in the collection here. I can see that it's in the collection up in this. I think we should just like relabel this relations tab, Gabriella. And I think I can also see that it's in the collection from, not from here. I did add it to this collection, didn't I? I thought that I'd even tested this. Well, fun times all around. Okay, so that's structural metadata. Again, we have collections. Collections can contain any number of objects, and objects can be members of more than one collection. Objects can also be members of other objects. The terminology we use for that internally is component, and then we have files. And regardless of whether an object is a component or not, it can directly be members of individual collections. And there's a certain amount of policy level configuration for what different collection types can and can't do in terms of who can be members of them. Okay, so another sort of small thing that we got done this sprint was a carryover from the last time round, which is file download. So this object got uploaded. It has in the individual files have their own little display page like this, where you can see what's happened to them. You can see some file level metadata. Characterization and fixity checks are things we can discuss later as well. Some file metadata is extracted now, mainly to support this download. You can save that file. And this download is sort of targeted at administrative users. It's not a public facing download approach. But again, some file metadata is extracted to support that download from the browser, but we're not yet doing formal file characterization. We expect to integrate with FITS, which will do, like if you uploaded a PDF called image.jpg, then it would notice that it's a PDF and extract real technical metadata about it. And likewise, fixity, we have some UI hooks for it, but we're not actually running fixity checks at this point. I can also, I think, download this object from over here, or this file. One thing that's notable is that the file names are retained, so it's not, I probably could have done a more interesting demo of this with a more compelling name, but image.jpg is in fact the name of the thing that I uploaded. It's not like some placeholder that the system added. And likewise, if I do, this is one also, yeah, I uploaded the same one multiple times, but this one I think is going to be upload.txt, yeah. So again, those are the names of the files that I uploaded. That was a requirement that came out in the requirements gathering process. Okay, so that's file download. We also have done some work on an initial batch ingest process. So the batch ingest is has its own UI. I can do oh dear, I have to browse to the right place now. Let's see if I can think on my feet. Resource. Serve. Comment. Batch CSV. There we go. So we have a sort of initial dummy CSV file for the batch process. We also have a sort of initial file source. So one of the problems that we face with batch ingest is where do we pull large scale content files from? And the solution that we have for that is sort of to abstract it, and then there's an initial implementation that's based on S3 buckets, which are also where we store the actual managed commit content. And so the idea is sort of, if you have content in the right place already, then and have it aligned with the batch CSV, then you should be able to upload a batch. Oh, and look, it works. That's really nice. And then, so that's more or less the story with batch at this point. you can the idea is sort of the metadata format and the file storage are both abstracted so that we can support different metadata formats and different file storage. And our sort of strategy is to start with some batch ingest processes that serve immediate needs, and then add file formats and storage needs as we go. The other part of batch that I'm not going to try to demo because I haven't actually like prepared a file that's going to fail validation. But supposing that we added CSV files that were sort of like missing required metadata like titles, we should fail that before we try and upload any objects from that batch and provide some kind of user feedback. Okay, so that's the story on batch. It's sort of a trail marker pattern. We sort of lay the trail and then use the path to build out more robust feature sets. Okay, and then following from that, we did do some work on batch workflow. And in order to show the batch workflow, I'm going to start by showing the individual object workflow, just so that we are all on the same page about what's meant by workflow here. So, so the rough story is when an object is first deposited in a commit, or to be more, I sort of like to avoid the word deposited because I think it carries connotations, but when commit first encounters an object, so you go through the form or you upload it through a batch upload, it enters a workflow that's dependent on what project it's deposited into. The workflows themselves are configurable per commit instance. So if you deploy a new commit, you can specify what workflows are in place, and then create projects that use those workflows. And the workflows, what they do is they define states that an object can be in, and then define actions that are available from specific states. And then they specify roles that can carry out those actions given an object in a state. So to be more concrete about it, you might deposit an object and it would go into a state needs review, and then some set of users are going to have access to be reviewers within that project. And they have the option, in this case, because I'm an admin, I actually have access to all actions on all. So I can say, okay, I'm going to approve this. Looks fantastic. Great object 100. And that individual object should now have moved to a new state where different actions are available. And we can see, in fact, it's gone to a state that's called completed, or displays as completed at least. And I have different actions here. I can still, as a reviewer, request changes, or I can do a comment. And effectively, comments are just workflow actions that point back to the same workflow state. So that's the idea. From what states are available, what actions are available from those states, and which roles can do which actions are configurable as part of the workflow. And when you do an action, various side effects can trigger. One of those is that notifications are sent to this little notifications dashboard. So I clicked it away now, but there was a little red icon by this bell saying that I had notifications that are new. And you can see the various notifications. I'll clear them out because I don't want to have endless notifications, and I can go back and do this object once more, request changes. It's a little contrived, but you can see. So now, in my capacity as a different role, I have these different actions. Request review, and I'll go ahead and do. Okay. Hopefully this satisfies my stickler reviewer. And I'll just emphasize, this is just the example workflow process that we've deployed in this test app. Again, the workflow is like sort of arbitrarily configurable with different states and different actions. We anticipate that we'll use this workflow process in a lot of interesting ways because it's a very powerful configurable tool. So we think, for instance, that we'll use this to move objects through a state that mints arcs for them. It may be useful for triggering, pushing things to discovery front ends, or moving them into preservation status. And the individual campuses are sort of at leisure to use this in whatever way is best for them. Okay, so that was a whole, like, I'll approve this one again. So that's the workflow process for an individual object. Our expectation is that much more often than doing this sort of very fiddly individual object processing workflow, that what we'll want to do is move content into Comet in large scale, and then move it through the workflow in the units of those batches. So that's the work that we did this sprint. And if I go, I think the UI on this probably wants a pass-through refinement, but I can grab a workflow that looks like me just then. I can grab a batch, and I can do batch review and say, again, a little contrived, but hopefully illustrative. And the whole batch should move through the workflow together. I think there may have only actually been one record in that batch. And some of these previous batch ingest objects were me from earlier. And push it back through again. So there you go. That's the sort of idea behind the batch workflow process. And again, I think that the UI that we just saw will probably get refined as we actually use this. But the infrastructure work to make this possible, I think is a really compelling feature add. Okay, so the last thing that I want to say before I come down to upcoming is that I just want to emphasize how much of the work that happened in this work cycle in particular, the last one as well, but in this work cycle especially, the development team was doing a ton of work in the upstream Samvera community code bases. And that's really important strategically for us because part of our goal here is to not end up with a product that that we're sort of alone in maintaining and carry the burden on. But instead, we're interested in sort of sharing that responsibility with a broad community. So a lot of this is feature add on the base platform that we're using rather than development that we're doing locally. It's been sort of a learning curve for our development team to work that way across the upstream code base and our local one. But I think it's really started to pay off in this in this work cycle in particular, and I hope that it continues to do that. Okay, so what's upcoming? I think I can go back to present mode now. So that was that I think the demo that we just showed was demonstrative of us succeeding at the goals that we set out for this sprint. So we wanted to make sure that collections could work, and we wanted to make sure that batch ingest could work in a baseline kind of way, in part so that we could do this next upcoming step, which is that UCSB would like to do a data migration, and indeed is starting work on a data migration from Alexandria Digital Research Library to running Comet instance. So prerequisites for this are we need to build up a metadata configuration that gives us compatibility with the AVRL schemas. So Chrissy and I are going to be working on that shortly. And then we need to make sure that we have a workflow configuration in place that lets us do batch review for that migration. So I think what that will look like is a full-scale test of the metadata configuration, but especially the batch ingest functionality, and just the basic, like, are we storing content in a way that's sustainable, that kind of stuff. So that's planned as off-cycle work since it's campus focused, but I think it's really going to go a long way towards putting Comet through its paces as a system that manages content. And then at some point over winter, we're going to be having conversations about the integration with discovery layers. And particularly, we're interested in pushing content out to IIIF, to Shoreline, to Starlight, et cetera, so that Comet becomes an on-ramp to public-facing content. So getting things under management becomes the way that we get them pushed out to the public. And then last, but definitely not least, we have a big open question about what UCSD MVP is going to look like and what it will take for us to be able to say yes to getting UCSD content into a running Comet system. So we owe ourselves some scoping conversations about that now that we've gotten to the point where ADRL migration seems feasible, and getting greenfield content into a Comet system seems feasible. that's just a diagram, which we can come back to, but I included here for general interest. I told Gabriella that I would put it at the end so that it wasn't too scary before we looked at all the UI stuff. Okay, I think that's it for comment demo, and I'm a little over time, so I want to hand it off to Chrissy for upcoming work cycle and then questions.
All right, so I know we have at least one question in the chat, and so I'll encourage everyone, if you have questions that came up in your brain in response to the demo, please, that's a really great way to put them in the chat. This next section is super short, and so we'll get to the questions in just a minute. So next slide, please. All right, so we do have, it's so funny, now I have my notes up. So you'll see here our first work cycle of 2022 is scheduled to run from January 19th through March 15th. We haven't quite finalized exactly sort of which products are going to be included in this work cycle. It will most likely include those the shoreline work that we chose not to do in this current work cycle. And we're also anticipating continued work on comment. We are evaluating both the progress, so we'll get some feedback from the UCSB testing during this off cycle, and checking in with all the various product teams about pressing needs there. And we also are in the sort of the middle of a Surfliner all hands, and so we're having some planning with the whole team that will happen at the beginning of December. The other thing that isn't represented on this calendar is that we're going to start experimenting, possibly on a regular basis, with scheduling some dedicated sprints during the off cycle for the development teams to really have an opportunity to focus on the maintenance and upgrades to our in-production products, because most of our on-cycle time has really been focused on products that we are still in the middle of developing. So we did something really similar to this previously to address some outstanding DevOps work, and it worked out really well. So if this also works out as well as that did, I think it's really likely that we'll adopt this as a practice moving forward, at least while we're in this period of time where we have a bunch of things still under production, but under development, but we're starting to have more of them roll into production. So, you know, it's something that the team is always working to figure out how to balance between the two. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder of all of the different places that you can stay up to date with our progress and communicate with the team. We have 2 Slack channels on the UC Tech Slack, Surfliner and Surfliner Announce. The latter one is really geared towards stakeholders, so we try to push out announcements of like sprint review demos and things like this event, but doesn't have the 20,000 messages over 3 years chatter that you see in our regular Surfliner channel. We also have the Surfliner blog at surfliner.ucsd.edu, and you can always reach out to either myself or Jessica or the product owners of the specific product that you have a question regarding. So next slide. And so I think with that, it is now officially time for questions. I'll go ahead and read out the one that's in the chat. I think that's really a Tom and Gabriella question. Christella says, this is looking great. Just a couple of questions about the terms. Is there a difference between a work and an object? And what's a project?
Okay, so I'll treat those as 2 separate questions, because I think so. You'll see in this user interface, you'll see some cases where the term work is used, and some cases where the term object is used. That's just actually, those are exactly the same, and that we're just sort of in the process of catching all the places where the base UI says works, and replacing that terminology with objects, just because we like objects better than works. That's just ideology. So the answer is no, there's no difference, and it's just sort of an artifact of process that there's still some places where work is displayed. Similarly, you'll see some places where the term admin set is used. That's likewise admin set and project are the same thing, and that probably doesn't actually clarify what they are. But you can think of a project as a special kind of collection. And the thing that's special about a project is that every object has to be put into one of them. So in order for an object to be managed in a Comet system, it needs to be inside a project. And that project has some policy level impacts. The most prominent of those is that it decides what workflow and therefore what workflow roles and what users have access to what workflow roles. And I didn't show this in the workflow stuff, but we did actually start on this page. It's possible for me to like add Chrissy as a reviewer on the default project, for instance. And so I can edit what users have access to what roles in a given project. I do think that this UI is a little bit clunky, but it does sort of make the point, like if I'm an administrator on a project, then I have very granular control over who's allowed to submit to that project, who's allowed to review work in it, like whatever the actions are that are configured in the workflow, I can decide who gets to do those actions as the project administrator. I hope that is a clear enough answer to the question.
And I hope too, if I can add, Christella, I hope that this makes sense for the UCSD workflow currently in place for collections. I think that depending on what project we're involved in, we do have different individuals working with certain collections, depending on who the provider is, if it's special collections or it's research data folks. So I hope that this project idea makes sense to you in this regard.
Yeah, I'm still a little murky on it, but is it like, so it's kind of like repository, like there's the special collections, the RDCP, and then like the general library. So it's like that kind of level of grouping.
I think it could be. Do you mind if I chime in? I have it.
Yeah, go ahead, Chrissy.
I have it like a specific use case that I'm thinking of that's real for why I might choose to use a different project. And so we have a collection that half of it's fully digitized and available through ADRL, and half of it still needs its metadata. And so I might choose to create a batch complete object ingest for that's already published, right? We'll just migrate that in, and I'll add that to, I will keep those groupings of objects separate from this other grouping of objects that still needs their metadata. So I'll bring in one, attach it all as a project, move it through the batch ingest workflow, which includes publishing it to all the same collection or adding it to the same collection. And then this other group of materials that still needs description, I'm going to add that as a separate, I'm going to add that to a separate project set so that I can put it through the metadata creation workflow. The target is still the same collection, but I have a desire to bring them through two different workflows. And I think there's a bunch of different ways you can slice and dice this, sort of based on your institution, you might want to bring in, say, all things from your special collections into one project. I think that that's really up to you all. The piece for me that's really helpful is to think about it is that a specific workflow is attached to that project. And so if you have objects in the same archival collection that need to go through different workflows, you can separate them into separate projects. And I think this is fairly common where you'll bring in like a batch of 1,000 things and then 6 months later, another batch of 1,000 things. So that's how you can sort of keep them all together and run them through the same workflow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll be thinking about it. But
Okay.
so like, is the project more tied to the workflow, like the steps and the processes that it goes through, or is it more tied to like the administrative access, like who gets access to it and the roles and responsibilities? Because I think, and then now I'm not thinking of it like a repository. It's more about the actions, right?
Yeah, so I think those things are sort of a one, right? The what in this context, the what steps does it go through and what users have access to do those steps are sort of grouped together. So if you wanted, and that's not to say that that you couldn't have multiple projects that assign the same steps with different sets of users. But I guess that's the level of focus is like, if I have a different set of policies about who's going to do what or who has access to do what, then I probably want a different project. And I think it's important also, I think maybe Christella, you already see this, but it's important also just to note that that the project is meant to be sort of not null in terms of its curatorial meaning, right? Like it's not a meaningful collection for anything other than the administrative and policy purposes.
Joshua has a question.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, can a collection or objects kind of graduate out of one project and into another?
That's not a concept that we've grappled with really, but I see where you're going with it. Like we have thought, okay, so at a certain point in a workflow, we might consider an object sort of transitioned into a preservation pattern where the workflows become long-lived, and so if I browse over here, oh wow, okay, now I can't even see objects. Maybe this instance will work. Okay, so but if I browse over here and I go, I can see that this says completed. We've been sort of moving away conceptually of thinking of workflows as ending. Despite this saying completed, I can still like request changes. So it's sort of, Josh, for your purposes, I think the workflow is a state machine, and the way that we might think about graduating something from one stage in that state machine to another, I think might be less switching it from one project to another and more like building that into the workflow to begin with, right? Like there's no path back to the editorial stage, then it might, right? Like it's just a different process from that point on.
I was just thinking about Chrissy's example of like, okay, here's a collection where half of it's treated one way, the other half's the other. Well, what if the other half catches up, right? Then do you move it into the other project with the other half, or?
I think that's where it's important that it's not a curatorial thing, right? Those objects will all go into the same collection for for curatorial purposes, and that's where like that meaning of them belonging together lives. I might just stop pushing objects through the legacy workflow at some point, but still deposit them to the same collection.
Yeah.
Does that track for you?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I think we are technically like 3 minutes over, although I know it's 7 minutes before noon. So depending on if you're used to 60-minute meetings or 50-minute meetings, you're either like, they're really late or I still have time. But we're happy to stick around a few more minutes if there are any other questions.
I always have more questions, but I can always pick Gabriella's brain later.
If you haven't, I'd love to hear your questions. If you have any today. Other people
yeah,
have the same.
I think I'll struggle through that project concept a little bit more, and now I'll worry a little bit about how are we representing that repository concept, like how the groupings larger than collections. So that's something just to think about. But the only other question that really stuck out to me was just, Tom, when you were talking about objects and like the notion of, an object could be grouped with other objects and kind of like what we consider a component. So I'm just wondering, like, so if I'm hoping that we're actually flattening things so that everything's an object and gets an arc. Is that correct? And then you would just be able to build complex objects of multiple objects.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, this is one of the things that we like about this structural model is that there aren't a lot of separate ideas in it. Right, like all the objects are just objects, and yeah, I think the idea is very much that at least whenever the campus policy-wise is minting arcs, that they would all get them, and the relationship between objects becomes
More explicit.
Yeah. The fact of something being a component is a relational concept, it's not a ontological one, if that makes sense, right? Like it's not a component isn't a type of object. It's defined by the object being a member of another object.
And then what are the requirements to be an object? Like, does it have to have a file? Are there certain fields that are required?
So there are no upfront universal requirements. It's certainly possible to say that it needs to have a file, but we have a specific use case for I'd like to make objects without any, and I think that use case is satisfied. Like geez, we're having a lot of fun. Okay. I think that I should be able, so you can see this title is required. That's driven by configuration. So it's conceivable that I could define an object with no metadata at all. And I want to test. Oh yeah, no files. So if I satisfy that it has a title, then I can save it, and it doesn't need to have files. We have specific user stories for both the I would like to deposit an object file first and then describe it later, and the I would like to deposit an object metadata first and then go find the files through some other process. And we anticipate that both of those workflows will be of interest for batch purposes as well. So the file first approach is something that we expect to use at UCSB in the digitization lab, like content coming off the camera or off the scanner. We want it to see Comet early in the process, or we want Comet to see it early in the process before any need for like descriptive processing has gone on. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. And then does it get an arc at that point?
So where we are with arcs right now is that the infrastructure for actually minting them is present. So we like have an Easy ID API endpoint and configuration that will mint the arcs from Easy ID. But and I forget what the story is with the UCSD one, but we did grapple with that in some way or another. So the arcs minted from the UCSD arc minter are somehow dealt with in Comet, and I might have to answer that question that you didn't ask in a different context. But anyway, when we actually mint the arcs is a policy question. So we're not doing it as a prerequisite to making an object. So you can see that the ID in this URL is just a number and it's sequential. So Comet's managing Comet's managing files before the point of arc minting, at least conceptually. And then where in the workflow process we choose to mint arcs is a per campus or even a per project decision. So conceivably you could say like, oh, in this project, I want to mint the arc the second Comet sees it, and I never want to think about a different ID. Or in this project, lots of stuff is going to come off the camera, and it's perfectly possible that we'll tombstone all of it and never want to waste precious arc namespace on it. So both of those flows are possible, and it's sort of up to the campuses how we'll manage that. I think maybe that answers.
Yeah, that's helpful. So then, but then it's by the campus or by the project that you can decide?
I think it's, so strictly speaking, it's by the workflow.
Okay.
And which are what workflows will be supported is a per campus decision. So if UCSD decided that it wanted to have some objects in Comet that don't have arcs, then there would be some workflow that you could choose on a per project basis that would do that. Sorry that this is very complex, but
No, that's helpful.
The answer is sort of like per campus, and then assuming that there's multiple strategies for arc minting at the campus, and then per project.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's great. I'm glad to have that flexibility.
All
And if
right.
you need use cases, just ask. I've always got
Oh,
use-
I want to hear them.
All right, so we are now officially at noon. So I'm going to thank you all for the wonderful questions and thank you for attending today. We really, really appreciate the engagement, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have additional comments or questions. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.